Hello, I'm Peter Van Dusen, and this is a special edition of Primetime Politics on CPAC, continuing coverage of Budget 2022. It is Chrystia Freeland's second budget focused on affordability and housing, economic growth, and the green economy. The budget also signaled a promise to rein in massive deficits. It's also aimed at satisfying the demands of the NDP as part of the deal to keep the minority government afloat for the next 3 years. Coming up, political reaction and expert analysis. But first, the key details of the budget unveiled today. The Finance Minister describes this budget as a fiscally responsible plan that will encourage economic growth in a time of global uncertainty while making life more affordable for Canadians.
And we are committed to reviewing and reducing government spending because that is the responsible thing to do.
The budget unveils $31.2 billion in new spending over the next 5 years on everything from housing to defence to climate change. Even with that new spending, the government's deficit track is lower than predicted in the economic update in December, mostly because of the end of most pandemic support programs and higher government revenues and job growth. The budget pegs the deficit for this year at $52.8 billion, down from $58.4 billion forecast in the economic update. The deficit drops to $39.9 billion next year and continues to fall until it reaches $8.4 billion in 2027. And the government's chosen fiscal anchor, the debt-to-GDP ratio, is also dropping more quickly, 46.5% down to 41.5% by 2027. So where is the money going? Housing is a big focus. The budget follows through on the campaign promise last fall to spend $4 billion to build 100,000 new homes in urban areas by 2025, and $2.7 billion for low-cost and co-op housing. Ottawa will also create tax-free savings accounts to allow first-time home buyers to save up to $40,000, and extend the rent-to-own program until 2025 with a promise to make it more flexible. The budget also follows through on the promise to impose a 2-year ban on the purchase of residential properties by foreign buyers who aren't going to live in the home. And investors who buy and flip a house within 12 months, they'll face full taxation on their profits as business income. The government also promises to engage with provinces to create a home buyer's bill of rights, along with a national plan to end blind bidding. The budget also includes an additional $4 billion over 7 years to improve and expand Indigenous housing as part of an $11 billion package focused on improving education, health, and business outcomes in Indigenous communities.
We recognize that the central challenge in Canada when it comes to housing is a lack of supply, and this budget is about tackling that head-on.
The war in Ukraine exposed serious gaps in Canada's military capabilities. The budget promises $8 billion in additional spending on defence over the next 5 years, money that will focus largely on the ability to defend North America and replace shortfalls of critical equipment. But there are few details. It will also be used to buy more weapons for Ukraine. The new funding will bring Canada's share of defence spending relative to GDP to 1.5%, still well below the 2% demanded by NATO. The budget also includes the promise of a major review of defence policy. It also promises $900 million over 5 years for cybersecurity to fight foreign disinformation campaigns. The budget commits $5.3 billion to a new national dental care plan for lower-income families by 2025 and beginning with children under 12 this year. That spending was part of the agreement the minority Liberals reached with the NDP in return for a pledge by New Democrats to keep the Liberals in power for 3 more years. The Liberals also commit to tabling a new National Pharmacare Act and getting it passed by the end of next year. The budget also includes another NDP demand, a tax on financial institutions such as banks and insurance companies that have padded their profit margins during the pandemic. They'll pay a one-time 15% surtax on taxable income over $1 billion. The budget also introduces a permanent increase from 15% to 16.5% in the corporate tax rate on taxable income over $100 million for banking and life insurance groups. Small business, on the other hand, gets a tax break in the budget, a more gradual phase-out of the small business tax rate to allow businesses to expand. The budget also unveils a new Canada Growth Fund to attract private investment, mostly in green technologies, to drive innovation and productivity. The budget sets aside $15 billion for the new fund over 5 years and hopes to attract $3 of private investment for every dollar of public money. The budget also includes a new refundable investment tax credit to accelerate the development of cost-effective projects for capturing carbon emissions. The rate would be as high as 60% until 2030, but would be cut in half after that. The tax credit will also cost the government $5.6 billion over the next 8 years. There's also $3.8 billion over 8 years to speed up the production and processing of critical minerals needed to build electric vehicle batteries. And finally, the budget notes the risks that could upset the government's economic plan, including the uncertainty around the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, global economic restructuring, and potential threats to traditional supply chains. Well, let's discuss the budget with Randy Boissonnault. He's the Associate Minister of Finance and the Minister of Tourism for Canada. Mr. Boissonnault, good to see you again. Thanks for taking time to speak with me this evening.
Thanks very much, Peter.
The thrust of this budget is to make life more affordable for Canadians. So what I want to know is, how will they know it's working? How will this budget take effect and have people go, hey, I just realized my life's getting more affordable?
It's a great question, Peter, and it's entirely our intention to make life more affordable for Canadians. And I guess an example that I would use is something that happened to me on the doors maybe 2 weeks ago in my own riding of Edmonton Centre. I met Graham and Claire, and I came up to the door, and their little daughter, Molly, was there. And I said, how are things going? And they said, Randy, the childcare thing is magical. Like, Claire's back at work, and Molly's having a great time, and we're saving thousands of dollars. We didn't think it could get done this fast, and it's really changed our lives. And so those are the kind of things that I want to hear. When I talk to young moms and they tell me that the Canada Child Benefit is helping them make ends meet, and that benefit is indexed to inflation, that's also an example of how this budget is responding to some of the pressures that Canadians are facing. I think, Peter, also people telling us that they're able to get their first home, that they're going to take advantage of that first-time home buyers incentive. It's like an RSP for your home. It's tax-free in, tax-free out, $40,000, which takes a big chunk out of your down payment on your first home. So that's the kind of things that I think people will say.
Let's talk about that. All
Sure.
the new measures for home buyers to help them buy homes, according to a lot of economists, could actually push up the rate of inflation. What do you say to that?
Well, I think it's really clear, and you've heard the Deputy Prime Minister say this, and I've said this in the House of Commons many times, that inflation in Canada is not a made-in-Canada solution. We are facing it, and that's why we're working hard to make life more affordable. But if you take a look at the tragic war in Ukraine started by Russia, if you take a look at the energy shocks, the fact that China still has a zero COVID policy, and that's gumming up our supply chains, those are at the root of inflation. And what I do know is that if we actually can get people into housing, into homes, and they're able to have jobs, then those are two of the most important economic pillars that any of us could want. And if you take a look at the rapid housing program, Peter, those are examples of houses that have been, by the time from the announcement to when people move in, is less than 12 months. I know, because I've got two of them in my own riding. Those are the kind of success stories that I think are going to come out of this expanded, doubling of new home buys over new home builds over the next 10 years.
According to the budget numbers, the housing supply measures could create 800,000 homes over the terms of the investments, but the country needs double that. So how will you address that ongoing shortage?
Well, I think this is where some of the measures like making sure that we don't have the foreign home buyers in, and we're going to use our fiscal weight as a federal government to work with municipalities to make sure that they're speeding up the permitting process, that they're actually making more land available, that they're actually densifying where they need to, and that working with municipalities directly and making sure that they understand that if they want the funding, they've got to speed up that process will also help. And the Deputy Prime Minister was very clear on this, and we've been clear on this. The government alone isn't going to solve this issue, and so it's a community issue, it's a business issue, and it's a government issue, and that's why I'm very excited to see such an investment in co-ops as part of Budget 2022.
This is described as a growth budget, but economists aren't rushing to change any growth projections right now because of what they've seen today. So how will that growth happen?
Well, look, the economists they're not going to predict growth, Peter. They're only going to measure it once it's happened. That's the way the economists do it, is they look in the rearview mirror. But I can tell you everything from the Canadian Innovation Innovation Agency that we're talking about with $1 billion. The Canada Growth Fund is a serious fund, capitalized at $15 billion, to make sure that we take $3 for every $1 we're putting in as a federal government, so a $60 billion fund to make sure that we can have the kind of investments in clean and renewable technologies. The Royal Bank itself has said that we need about $150 billion in investment to get to net zero each year to 2050, and the government doesn't have that much money, but we can actually crowd that kind of money in from a financial perspective. That's a great thing. And if there's any business people watching, entrepreneurs, we're going to change the rule that your taxes go up when you get to $15 million in size to $50 million, because we want Canadian companies with great IP, great know-how, to be able to scale and grow and stay right here in Canada.
You talked about the Canada Growth Fund. That's newly created in this budget. It feels a lot like Son of the Infrastructure Bank, which didn't deliver as promised. So how will this be any different?
Well, I think, and look, I'm in finance, and I was in the government when we passed this early in our first mandate. I think the initial parameters of the Canada Infrastructure Bank were a bit narrow. What the Growth Fund is very clearly indicating, it's not beholden to infrastructure projects. This is actually working with companies that are planning to set up shop here, or Canadian technologies that want to scale and help on our pathway to net zero. And the fact that we're going to make investments, hold them, and have that be part of the asset base of Canada is a really smart strategy. We see it happening in other countries, and we want to make sure that we're on the leading edge of making sure that those investments happen here in Canada.
All right. Associate Minister of Finance, Randy Boissonnault. Thank you for your time tonight, sir. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Peter.
Well, let's get a reaction now from the official opposition. Candice Bergen is the interim leader of the Conservative Party. She's with me now. Ms. Bergen, good to see you again. What's your reaction to this budget unveiled today?
Well, from our look at it, we can see it's an NDP budget. It's delivered by an NDP Liberal government, but it definitely is a budget that has been asked for by the NDP and that the Prime Minister is giving them. He's taken the money that he's been collecting from Canadians who suffered through inflation over the last year, and using that money to pay for the promises that he's made to the NDP, and in turn the NDP are going to prop him up. So we're disappointed. We had some things that we wanted to see. We're not seeing them, including tax cuts for Canadians, some relief for Canadians, some relief from spending, which would control inflation, and then something that would seriously address the housing inflation crisis that's also going on. And we saw none of those things addressed.
Right. So there's a deal with the NDP, but the spending in this budget is actually a lot lower than new spending in other Liberal budgets, a lot lower than people thought it might be. The deficit will fall faster than earlier projected, and the debt to GDP ratio will fall more quickly as well. How significant do you think those markers are?
Well, it's ironic. We've become so accustomed to the Liberals' massive spending that when we see over $30 billion in spending, we think that's not too bad. They collected $39 billion from everyday Canadians paying taxes on essentials like gasoline, and they're using it to pay for spending. They have doubled the deficit since they took government. They have increased permanent government by 50%, and in the last 2 years by 25%. This Liberal Party is unrecognizable. They are not the party they were 10 or 20 years ago. They have moved so far to the ranks of the NDP that somehow now we say it's a good thing when they're only spending $39 billion. $450 billion actually this year is going to be the deficit.
Let me ask you about the housing measures here. $10 billion to make housing more affordable, to create more housing, dampen foreign demand, and work on the supply side. How do you feel about those measures?
Well, we very much agree with measures that would limit foreign ownership. The announcement that we've seen today has a lot of gaps in it, and so we're not sure that it will actually address the problem of foreign ownership when it comes to housing inflation. But secondly, one of the biggest contributors to housing inflation in Canada is lack of supply, lack of houses being built across the country. We're not seeing any measures in this budget that would address that. That really needs to be addressed at the municipal level, and the federal government has a role to play, but they have to, first of all, recognize it's not them throwing a few billion here or there at municipalities that will solve the problem. They need to incentivize, whether it's carrots or sticks, they need to incentivize municipalities and cities to allow builders to build so that more homes, especially entry-level homes, will be built across the country. That will be, in part, that will help lower the cost of housing. The programs that we did see them announce in terms of kind of a blended RSP and TFSA program really won't have any effect for many years. So those programs will see not one house built or one house purchased this year.
Okay, so safe to say, just quickly, the Conservatives will be voting against this budget.
That's right. We will never support an NDP budget.
All right, Candice Bergen, thanks so much for your time tonight. Appreciate it. Well, let's bring in the leader of the NDP now, Jagmeet Singh, for his reaction to the budget. Mr. Singh, good to see you again.
Thank you.
As part of your agreement with to support the Liberals, you already had an early briefing on the budget, so there shouldn't really be any surprises here for you. So does it meet the demands you negotiated with the minority Liberals in your deal to keep them in power?
So we made a deal to use our power to get help to people. People needed help given how difficult things have been. And what we were able to obtain in the agreement was reflected in the budget. Help to get people their teeth fixed. So dental care, starting with children under 12, and real investments in housing that we fought for, increasing the amount of housing, changing the definition of what is affordable, and a top-up of $500 for some of the Canadians who need help the most, with a Canada Housing Benefit increase of $500. So real help to people, that's important, and that's why we are in a position to acknowledge that our agreement has been met. Okay. And we're still going to oppose and critique things that we don't agree with, like the government's approach to the environmental crisis, the climate crisis that we're up against. We think we should end fossil fuel subsidies. They've increased them. We also think we should be increasing transfers to healthcare generally. That's not in there. So there's things that we will continue to raise as concerns, but there's significant support for Canadians in this difficult time, and that's meaningful, and we'll be supporting that.
Okay, let's circle back to some of those things. The National Pharmacare Act, there's a mention of it in the budget with a promise of to introduce an act and have that act passed by the end of 2023, I think it is. Is that the timetable you negotiated, and are you satisfied with that?
That is our timetable. We want to bring in things in a responsible way. This year we're focused on getting the dental care program started, and so we're putting all our emphasis on that. It's reflected in the budget. In our agreement, the Pharmacare Act, the Canada Pharmacare Act, would be passed in 2023, so that's in line with the timelines that we've set up. And we'll continue to push hard to make sure that those are delivered. We know that this will take us continually pushing and fighting to make happen, but so far our agreement is being honored.
The carbon capture tax credits, you touched on it. It's part of the Liberal emissions reduction plan. It's now supported by the budget. There was a nod to it in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in their latest report. You oppose tax credits for carbon capture technology. How come?
Well, one, we think public dollars are very precious, and they should go towards workers, or they should go towards investing in the clean energy of the future, not towards profitable oil and gas companies. So we're in favor of eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. Instead of eliminating them, the government has gone and increased them. So we think that's the wrong approach. We think that carbon capture technology is also questionable. It's not clear it can achieve our goals, and putting so much public dollars behind it is the wrong decision, and we don't support that.
I guess that raises the question of whether maybe you could have got a better deal. Because if you don't support these things, your argument is that there's money going to those things that you think could have been better spent on social spending, different kind of spending. So I guess why not hold out for more?
This is a Liberal government, and the Liberal governments are in power. This is not a new Democrat government, nor a new Democrat budget. What we did in a minority government is use our power to get help to people. And so we're going to continue to get the help that people need. There's things that we disagree on. The agreement outlines that there will be disagreements. And on those things we disagree on, we'll fight and we'll push for better action, better steps taken, and that's what we'll continue to do. We absolutely oppose the government's approach to the environment, and we'll continue to fight to make sure that they're doing more to fight the climate crisis.
There are also increases in defense spending. Do you believe that they are appropriate in terms of bolstering Canada's defense capability, or is that money that should have been spent somewhere else?
Well, we did acknowledge, and for a long time, that our armed forces are being sent to do work where they don't have the sufficient equipment to do it. And so we think that's a reasonable increase in terms of having enough personnel to do the work that's required. That's also an area where we understand it's important to have investments. Our armed forces were incredibly important in dealing with the crisis in long-term care homes, both in Ontario and in Quebec. So that's an important area. We would have liked to see humanitarian aid increase as well as international development, but those are some important investments. Given that the world is less safe, people are worried that we need to make some investments, and that's appropriate.
All right, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, thanks for your time tonight, sir. Take care.
Thank you, sir.
Let's talk about the budget spending on defence, $8 billion over 5 years. Andrew Leslie is a retired Canadian Lieutenant General and former Liberal MP. He was the Deputy Commander of the NATO land forces in Afghanistan. He's been an outspoken critic of the military procurement process and the need for a major infusion of funding. General Leslie, good to see you again. Thanks for taking time to speak with me tonight. How satisfied are you with the commitments this budget makes to defence spending?
Completely unsatisfied.
Tell me why.
Since they've taken office, the Liberal government has reprofiled, reallocated, not spent over $12 billion that was promised to defense. So that $12 billion missing out of the defense envelope is now being replaced by $8 billion spread over 5 years, which is $1.6 billion a year. Each year, D&D doesn't spend $2 billion. So this is smoke and mirrors, point one. Point two is this gets us nowhere closer in an appreciable sense to spending 5%. And at a time when the Russian bear is savaging the Ukraine, slaughtering innocents, and the readiness of the Canadian Armed Forces has not been this bad in decades, $8 billion is not acceptable.
Okay, I mean, the new spending, you touched on it, the new spending will bring our spending to 1.5% of GDP on defense, still well below the NATO target of 2%. How do you think this will be viewed by NATO partners?
Not well. Canada right now is 10,000 troops short. That's about $1 billion, $1.5 billion per year. That's recurring. They're short of spare parts and ammunition and training facilities. That's at least another $1 billion per year, recurring. Over 5 years, 2 times 5 is 10. That's $10 billion right there over the next 5 years, just to bring them up to where they're supposed to be. That doesn't include the major new capital programs, which have been deferred or postponed or swept under the carpet over the last decade and are now urgently needed. And on top of that, we've got huge expenditures in the renewal of the North American Air Defense Agreement, which Canada has been delinquent on its payments for close to a decade.
Right. Part of the thrust of this budget is it's largely focused on North American concerns and the far north. And presumably that means, a greater commitment and resourcing of Canada's role in NORAD. What's urgently needed here?
Well, what's needed is any sort of defense capability up north. The Canadian Arctic is defenseless right now, and I'm not exaggerating. There are no permanently stationed troops there with any significant combat capability. There's no surveillance assets looking overhead. There's no drones that can stay up for hours. Our maritime patrol aircraft are, as old as I am, for goodness sake. We don't have ships that can operate up in the Arctic for any significant period of time. We have not started building those bases that the government's been talking about for 7 or 8 years. So if you look at the pie of the need compared to, if you would, the tray of resources that are available to carry that pie, the math just doesn't compute. $8 billion, considering there's $12 billion that's already been missing from the account, doesn't square. Our allies are going to be furious.
The budget also announces a defense policy review to consider the changing global environment. It will look at the size of the forces, the role and resources. What do you believe it needs to come up with?
A defense policy review can either be a welcome thing or it can be a stall for time, so governments don't have to make decisions on investments. Quite frankly, I think what the Russian bear is doing and the tensions that have been exacerbated by a variety of factors over the last months between China and India and Brazil, all that points to essentially a resurgence of a Cold War, which in certain cases is hot. It doesn't take a lot of rocket scientists to figure out what's needed. Planes, which they've just ordered, they'll be 5 or 6 years getting delivered. Ships, which still haven't been confirmed. refreshing of the Army equipment, more attention being paid to search and rescue, and the Arctic. The Arctic is a flank with Russia. Please, let's spend some real money on the Arctic to make sure that its future is secure, because right now it's defenseless.
Let's finish on this. You and I have talked about this before. Canada spends roughly $23 billion a year on defense, or should I say, and you've touched on it, allocates that amount because often the money isn't spent. You touched on this as well. The budget adds $1.6 billion a year more to that total. But it doesn't matter how much money there is really, right? If the old money isn't getting spent and new purchases are bogged down in an unworkable procurement system. Did you see anything in the budget about fixing that?
No, I did not, unfortunately. And there's only two people I now know who can fix it. One is the Prime Minister of Canada, and the other is the Minister of Finance. I've seen the budget procurement system work extremely quickly. At the height of the Afghan war, we went out and bought tanks and helicopters and heavy guns for the artillery and new light armored vehicles, which weren't light, and night vision systems and unattended aerial vehicles, and that goes on and on. And by the way, that was done with first a Liberal government and a Conservative government. So I know they can do it, but do they want to? Obviously not. They're pretty happy with the status quo, which means their defense capability is atrophied. Instead of investing appropriate funds just to start that healing process, they haven't even thrown them a lifeline. And though $8 billion sounds like a lot, it doesn't replace the 12 that's missing. So they're starting from a -4.
Okay. Andrew Leslie, thanks again tonight for your perspective on the budget unveiled today. Good to talk to you.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, my colleague Martin Stringer has been part of what's called the budget lockup today. It's been amended. It's a little different than in past times, pre-pandemic times, when that's where we all spent the day. But part of the budget process today to view documents and so on was virtual, but part of it was in person. And Martin spent the day at that lockup, going through documents and talking to experts. And let's go to him now, because he's got an interview with a man many Canadians who follow developments in Parliament and the economy will be familiar with. Martin?
Kevin Page, first question. How would you assess this budget?
It's an important budget in that it's the first budget of a new parliamentary session. It's a budget that's taking place in this historic uncertainty because of the Russia-Ukraine war. And I think it's a budget that makes some kind of first installment payments on some big initiatives, certainly falling out of the Liberal NDP agreement, but also the commitment to kind of move more towards 2% of national defense spending relative to GDP.
Okay, speaking of spending, how much new spending is in this budget?
It's a modest amount of spending. I think it will surprise people. The net new spending money in this budget is probably a little bit more than $31 billion over 6 years. The gross amount of spending, so to speak, and I'll explain the difference, is probably about in the $62, $63 billion range over 6 years. The difference between those two numbers is the government does raise revenues. There are some taxes that they promised that back on the platform that they would implement. That's being booked. There's some reprofiling of in infrastructure spending, and there's some government efficiency measures that reduces that net spending money. The net spending is $31 billion, which is again pretty small for 6 years in a $2.7 trillion economy.
Okay. The other question is, a lot of people are calling for a growth budget. What does this do for growth? Does it do anything for growth?
Yeah, so I mean, the assumptions, the planning assumptions that the economy will continue its strong growth that was there, that they were assuming back in December. So real growth probably in the 4% range this year. Continued reductions in the unemployment rate. So they have these sort of positive growth projections. The budget focuses a lot on what people would call the supply side of the economy, growing the housing stock. Investments in innovation and research to kind of stimulate a transition to a greener economy, and actually trying to promote labor force growth as well through higher immigration and previous investments in childcare. Now,
you mentioned, you call it sort of moderate spending, $31.2 billion in the scheme of things. The GDP, the deficit to GDP ratio, as well as the debt to GDP ratio are going down. Is there any risk? I mean, over the last few budgets, we've always been looking for a risk of structural deficits. Is that behind us now?
No, there's still a modest structural deficit in this plan. Again, with this strong growth that the government is assuming we're going to get in 2022, you would probably eliminate what economists would call was the output gap. The economy would be back operating at its potential in 2023 under these assumptions. So those deficits, which are kind of in the 1.5% range of GDP and shrinking, that would be what economists would call a structural deficit. Relatively small, I think, and probably looking more, resembling more what the deficit track was in a pre-COVID type of economy.
You still don't have a target date for getting out of deficit, though?
No, we generate, right throughout the medium-term deficits. Mind you, the deficits in nominal terms and as a percentage of GDP, they fall continuously throughout the medium term. That'll make Bay Street happy.
Last question. There are uncertainties, and the briefers here at this lockup mentioned the uncertainties. What do you make of them?
Yeah, there are enormous uncertainties. I think the government probably struggled with this budget. How do you address those uncertainties? Again, the forecast that they're assuming was taken from the private sector. It's an average private sector forecast. They surveyed in February, which is pre-war, for the most part, pre-Russia-Ukraine war. It really probably doesn't capture the uncertainty that we see building like week by week by week with respect to higher commodity prices. The government chose not to add a contingency reserve into these numbers, even though they're projecting pretty significant year-over-year declines. But definitely you could see in the policies that the government's recommending, it's staying away from large subsidies that would promote quicker consumption, would boost inflation. The government's trying to avoid that for the most part.
Last question, COVID in all of this?
I think the assumption is that for the most part, COVID is behind us. There's definitely some additional spending in here for the health sector kind of to deal with COVID. There was in the fiscal update as well, but it's not a central focus of this budget.
Okay, Kevin Page, thank you very much.
Well, the overarching thrust of the budget is affordability, whether it's on housing or jobs or childcare or the green economy. Armenia Elnisian is an economist and Atkinson Fellow on the future of workers. She joins me now. Armenia Elnisian, good to see you again, and thanks for your time tonight. Is this a budget that will make life more affordable? And if so, what do you see as the key measures to make that happen?
The key measures are housing and dental care. And we know that pharmacare is down the pike, and we know that early learning and childcare, which finally saw every jurisdiction signing on to a deal, will be actually rolling out now. So that will make a difference too in the coming months. These are all indirect ways of dealing with the direct hit. There's also an affordability question of how much can the government do. And there it was made very, very clear in both the numbers that the budget presented, but also what senior officials told us in the lockup, that we don't have an affordability problem for doing anything that we choose to do. Did you know that we are the 9th largest economy on the surface of the planet, and we are in this absolutely rarefied club of countries that can borrow at AAA rating? There's only 10 of us that can do this, and only one other country with as big an economy as us, Germany. But that said, we missed a huge opportunity, which was to address the looming healthcare crisis, and that's something I hope we talk a lot more about in the next few months, and dealing with the health human resource crisis that we are facing in every part of this country.
All right. So what should the budget have said about that?
Oh, I wish that they had done the same thing they did with early learning and childcare. People say healthcare is a provincial jurisdiction. So is early learning and childcare. Look, this budget talked about COVID as if it is a thing of the past. Its impacts are a thing of the past because economically we have 112% of the jobs we had before COVID hit, and GDP is up by over 1% real GDP. That's inflation-adjusted GDP from pre-pandemic. But what we also have inherited is a healthcare system in disarray and a long-term care system that is a debacle, that really failed seniors that required residential care, care in a long-term care facility. And here, the federal government could have said, we are going to be building on the strength of what we learned with the early learning and childcare agreements, that we can negotiate bilateral agreements. We can provide the funding to improve both the number of people providing care as well as the institutions, but they failed to do so. And I feel that that is a huge miss for a government that self-proclaims as feminist and understands the care economy to be at the foundation of the rest of the economy. If you're going to be doing unpaid care for people that are too young, too old, and too sick to work, you're not going to be doing your own paid work. Those people go to work so you can go to work.
Right.
And like it's every mention, there were 266 mentions of health in this budget. Not one referred to our health labor shortage. It's like, who do you think is doing the care work? Elves? We can do better than this. Absolutely, we can do better, and we must.
There are millions more in new spending in the budget, although not as much as some people thought there would be, and the fiscal track has improved since the economic update. So you're suggesting that there's, in fact, a lot more room to spend here, but critics will say, look, at some point you got to wind it down. What do you say to them?
Well, we are winding it down, $60 billion less because COVID income supports have finished, and revenues are up. They're hugely up. You know, the combination of a global pandemic's impact on supply chains plus a war because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine means that a third of all fertilizers are off the market. A quarter of wheat is off the market. The second largest oil and gas producer, which is Russia, is not sending to the rest of the world, or we're not buying it, by and large, except for Europe. That means Canada's market share in all three of those areas is growing. That means that revenues are growing. That means that producers' revenues are growing, and so are public coffers. In Alberta, they went from a deficit to a surplus in a blink of an eye because of what happened to the price of oil per barrel. So we absolutely can afford to do more. And in fact, that was the word in the lockup is, we could do more. We could do anything we wanted. Really, we chose to basically respond to the saber rattling on Bay Street. That's what this budget was about. This was responding to Bay Street saying, whoa there, puppies, don't go so fast. And they sent a message loud and clear to Bay Street, you'll get exactly what you want. Do you remember they said they were going to put a 3% surtax on the banks in the election platform? Well, it turned out to be only 1.5% surtax. You think lobbying doesn't work? It sure does.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Armenia Elnisian, thanks again for joining us tonight. Great to talk to you again, and take care.
Thank you. You take care too, Peter.
Indigenous leaders in this country were looking to the budget for major investments in many different areas, including housing. Budget 2022 commits another $11 billion to Indigenous housing programs to improve health, education, and social services. Roseanne Archibald is the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, and she's with me now. National Chief Archibald, I appreciate you taking time to speak with me this evening. It's good to see you again.
Thanks, Peter. Good to be here.
What's your reaction to the budget, and what's in it for First Nations in this country?
Well, I wanted to, first of all, say that, there's always a certain amount of rhetoric around budgets in Canada when it comes to First Nations. And for me, I really wanted to change the narrative and talk about what's really missing in this budget. And in terms of the budget, what First Nations need is really true economic reconciliation. When we look at some of the story around the budget, particularly this $19.5 billion windfall around commodities, it makes me think about Canada and how it derives all of its wealth from First Nations land. And yet First Nations have to wait for these budget cycles to see where their future will lie. And for me, I think we've got to be looking more to the future in terms of the fiscal relations that we have with Canada, particularly around having access to our resources, the wealth of this country. That is our birthright. And certainly we're not seeing that in these budgets. We're seeing small amounts. And, the story is always, it's a good investment, but it's not quite enough. And I think that narrative keeps going because we're not getting to where we really need to go in this country, which is true economic reconciliation, right, the rebuilding of First Nation economies, and significant relationship kinds of building around economies and the development of agreements that will lead to First Nations having access to their own wealth, building their own wealth, and certainly investing in their own communities, because that's what First Nations do, right, when they acquire wealth.
There is in the budget a chapter called, or a section called Partnering with Indigenous Peoples in Natural Resource Projects, money set aside to ensure meaningful opportunities for Indigenous participation as well as greater certainty for investors at the early stages of resource projects. Is that what you're talking about, or is that, maybe not enough, or early stages, or how do you view that in the budget?
Well, you're talking about, again, a program that really is not creating those kinds of relationships between the federal government and First Nations around sharing in the wealth of this country. So now you're diverting attention by saying, well, we're going to have this program that will allow you to build these resource agreements. Well, you know, what we really need is access to those resources, a share of those resources, a share of the wealth that is coming off of our lands and waters. That's what we really need. And these programs and projects that the federal government is doing is actually counterproductive to what we really need, which is to build our own wealth and have access to the wealth of our lands.
Okay, funding for housing was a big pre-budget ask, and I think it's been a significant ask in every budget since I've been covering budgets. That housing is in a crisis state now in many of the 634 First Nations across the country. It's been described as a $60 billion challenge to deal with the current needs and future population growth over the next 20 years, to deal with new housing needs and repairs and the backlog. So what difference do you think the funding in this budget will actually make?
Well, I was just on the phone with Minister Mark Miller just a few minutes ago talking about what these investments mean. So First Nations identified the need, for example, for $6 billion to really catch up to housing, the housing needs. And I believe that when you look at the bottom line of this budget, it's something like 2 point something that will go to First Nations on reserve. But again, my point is that why do we have to look to these kinds of programs and projects when, if we're building our own wealth, then we can build our own houses? When are we going to get there, Peter? That's where we need to get.
All right. Time is short tonight, but we'll end our conversation there. Roseanne Archibald, National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, thanks so much for your time tonight, and hope we talk again soon.
All right. Thanks, Peter. Take care.
Another key thrust of the budget is climate change and the green transformation of the economy, but there's a pretty big cloud hanging over the government's credibility with environmentalists over the approval of the Bay du Nord offshore oil project east of Newfoundland and Labrador, coming just days after the government laid out its plan for cutting emissions, including in the oil and gas sector in this country. Julia Levin's the Climate and Energy Program Manager at Environmental Defence Canada. Julia, thanks for taking time to speak with me tonight. What's your appraisal of this budget and what it promises to do to deal with the climate and the environment?
I'd say this is another failure of leadership when it comes to doing what it takes for the climate crisis, coming off of a long week of failures. So the key question is, are we spending what it takes? Are we investing in the proven solutions that the IPCC has told us will allow us to have emissions this decade? And we're not. We're just, the scale of spending in this budget is so falls short of what's needed. And on the flip side, there's enormous new fossil fuel subsidies in this budget. So basically, instead of investing in a safe future, we're doubling down on the very companies fueling the climate crisis.
How much money do you think needed to be spent if the government, if, in your view, was being serious about the climate?
Prominent economist Nicholas Stark has said that countries should be spending around 2% of their GDP on the climate crisis. So that's around $40 billion. That would have been a huge ramp up from where spending is now, but that's the kind of level that we're talking about. And of course, these are investments in our future. These are investments that make our homes better to live in, that give us cleaner air. These are investments that pay off. Instead, we see a tiny fraction of that and spread out over many years. One
of the key measures is this $15 billion Canada Growth Fund, supposed to be attracting private investment to help develop projects to reduce emissions and support and develop low-carbon industries. What do you think of that approach?
I have reservations. What we see when we have funding programs that are set up like this, and we have the Net Zero Accelerator, that's an $8 billion funding program that was set up last year, they lack climate conditions. So in actuality, what we're seeing is these programs give a whole bunch of money in fossil fuel subsidies to oil and gas companies. They're not actually aligned with the kinds of solutions that we need to be investing in. And similarly, one of my biggest concerns with this budget is that Minister Freeland ignored what 400 scientists across this country have said, what 30,000 Canadians asked for, and that was that she not go ahead with a new tax credit for carbon capture and storage. And instead, she put in a 50% tax credit. It's going to be a giant amount of our taxpayer dollars that goes towards something that isn't a climate solution.
Right. It could be up to 60% in the early days in some cases. But look, these carbon capture tax credits, it's part, as you say, of the Liberal emissions reduction plan. It's in the budget. Carbon capture technology and pursuing it was supported by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in their latest report. You oppose those investments in carbon capture technology. How come?
Just to clarify what the IPCC actually said. There's sometimes conflation between technologies that actually remove carbon from the atmosphere, that's called carbon dioxide removal, CDR, and carbon capture and storage. This doesn't remove carbon. So the IPCC actually said that carbon capture and storage is the least effective, most expensive way to reduce emissions, and the government shouldn't rely on it. And instead, Canada's doing exactly that. They're ignoring what the scientists are saying, and they're banking on a speculative technology to deliver huge emissions reductions. But carbon capture and storage has never been about climate solutions. It's actually been a way for oil and gas companies to access cheap carbon for more oil production. And that's what we're doing. We're subsidizing more production. Carbon capture and storage puts more carbon into the atmosphere than what it takes out.
Let's finish on this. What's your reaction to the approval of the Bay du Nord project? It's got 137 conditions, including that it must be zero emission by 2050. How does this factor into the conversation about the government's approach to climate?
The decision to approve the project was a slap in the face to the world's climate scientists and to communities across the world whose lives are on the line. It was an incredibly irresponsible decision, and I'll remind Canadians of the words of the UN Secretary General Guterres, who said investments in new fossil fuel projects are moral and economic madness. And he called countries that are continuing to produce new fossil fuels the truly dangerous radicals. Those are very strong words from the UN Secretary General that apply to Canada in this context.
All right, Julia Levin from Environmental Defence Canada. Thanks for your perspective tonight. Do appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Now, let's get some reaction from Canada's business community. Goldie Hyder, he's the president and CEO of the Business Council of Canada. He joins me now. Mr. Hyder, good to see you again. Thanks for your time tonight. What's your assessment of this budget?
Right direction. Lots to do still in terms of the specifics, as always is the case in these budgets. I think we should be happy about the deficit coming down as much as it has. But we have to remember there still is a deficit, and it still is well into the 100 billion plus range. And we've got a debt that we haven't begun to tackle as well. I think, Peter, we see elements of a plan here. There's we've been calling for a growth strategy and an actual growth plan. I think the elements are there. I'm hoping that we can work more collaboratively and in a genuine spirit of partnership with government to actually execute on that plan. And much of it is focused on the climate, but also the innovation piece, which I think is key. And we were very pleased to see the investment in defense. We called for it, and we said at the same time, please do a program review to pay for it. And it looks like they listened, and they're going to be doing just that.
One of the big features is this Canada Growth Fund, newly created, $15 billion, hoping to leverage private investment for the green transformation. What do you think of that?
Well, look, I mean, this is certainly a signature item for this government and this prime minister, so it's not a surprise that there's an allocation of $15 billion to bring down the emissions, to help build a low-carbon economy, and actually build a supply chain for critical minerals and batteries. So what I like about it is it's playing to our strengths. Our strengths are in natural resources, whether it's from mining or oil and gas or to even agriculture and so forth. So we like that aspect of it. It's more of putting the emphasis on the innovation piece as opposed to the invention piece. And that's okay. Let's work together to do that, because I think what Canadians know is that if we put our minds to it and we work in a spirit of collaboration, Canada can win. We can compete and we can win. Sure. And the business community can certainly be a big part of that.
It feels a little bit to a lot of people like modeled sort of on the infrastructure bank that was, not all that successul.
Yeah, I was going to say probably not the best comparison, given most have described that as comatose these days.
Right, but the idea is, look, we'll create this fund of public money, and that'll help us leverage private money. $3 to 1 is the expectation. What concerns you about how successful this might or might not be?
There is a difference here. First of all, I'm happy to see that the infrastructure bank is being redirected towards the energy transition, because right now, as I said, it's not doing very much. But what's different about this, I think, is that it's arm's length. It's got clearly an arm's length approach there, and it's got a real reliance on a partnership with the private sector, whereas I think the infrastructure bank was really trying to work more with provincial governments and other governments to bring about transportation infrastructure, again, which it didn't do a very good job of so far. I think this will help work in a collaborative way with business, because you're going to want to take that $1 that government's putting in and you want to make it $3. And if you can do that, you can do a lot of good things from an innovation perspective, which of course ripples into the job creation aspect of the economy as well.
Right. The government followed through on the NDP demand to slap a surtax on banks and insurance companies. What do you think of that?
Well, regrettable, because I think that that's really populist politics. It's short-term wins in a poll, but it's not good policy in the long run. And the reason for that is if you target a specific sector, every other sector says, am I next? And at a time in which we're trying to attract investment into the country, we should not have been sending that signal. I understand the politics behind it, Peter, but it's bad policy. What we should have done is said, look, we haven't had a tax review in this country since the Prime Minister was born. Why don't we do that instead and find out where there are opportunities to generate that? Any kind of a tax and spend agenda specifically targeted that way, I think it sends the wrong signal. It's unfortunate because, as I said, I want to be positive about many of the things that have been done right here, but on the tax and spend side, and frankly on the fiscal anchor side as well, it's not the way that I would have suggested that they go about it.
What should they have done?
Well, we would have preferred that they put the fiscal anchor on the take a look at the amount of spending that's taking place on the borrowing cost, the interest being paid on that deficit, and measure it against your revenues, which would have been much more fair in an environment when really, the nominal GDP growth that we've enjoyed is really spurned from the stimulus that the government spent in the pandemic, the oil boom that we had in the commodities, and of course the inflation all of that created gives you a much better picture, a rosier picture on the deficit to debt. Then if we take this approach, what's called the David Dodge model, look at how much you're spending on borrowing costs as a percentage of revenue, because revenues could slow down, Peter. There is a risk here of an economic slowdown, partly because we're going to be raising rates, but also because of what's going on with COVID and the war.
Quickly about the investment tax credit for business looking to develop carbon capture technologies. We got some of the details of that now. A 60% credit until 2030, as much as a 60% credit until 2030, then that gets cut in half after that. Will business welcome that, and will that spur them to move quickly to develop those technologies to reduce the effects of carbon emissions?
Well, business asks for it, so business certainly welcomes it. We, of course, ask for a higher percentage, but we understand that what's been given is fair, and I think that the industry will work collaboratively with government. It's a very important aspect of how, when business and government can work together to address a public policy issue of concern to Canadians and of all walks and stripes with climate change. And we can lead, Peter. I think what can happen here is we can actually build an industry around carbon capture and use that as a growth strategy in terms of being able to export that and help other countries bring down their emissions, which is actually a more important way, in some ways, of bringing down emissions, because Canada alone is just a very small fraction of global emissions.
All right, Goldie Hyder, thanks for your time tonight. Great to talk to you again, and we'll talk again soon, I hope. Take care.
Very well. Always good to see you, Peter. All the best.
You too. Take care. My colleague Martin Stringer, CPAC's Martin Stringer, had a chance to catch up with two parliamentary reporters for their thoughts on this budget and what's in it.
John Iveson, Susan Delacourt. First of all, what's the headline? You're both journalists and you're working in this room to produce a headline for this budget. What's the headline for this one?
I think it's an unusual headline for this government. It's a responsible, relatively prudent budget from a Liberal government. I never thought I'd say that.
Prudent in what way?
Well, we know there's inflation, and we've seen commodity prices rocket. So the government is sitting on a windfall. In fact, that windfall is $85 billion over 6 years, and yet in previous occasions it has spent the windfall, and in this occasion it doesn't. It's the spending Well, it's $62 billion. They raised a whole bunch of new money as well. So the net spending is only $31 billion. And the debt to GDP ratio, which we thought would be under great pressure, is easing downwards for the next 6 years towards 40%. I think the interesting thing is we thought that while the Bank of Canada is raising interest rates to try and choke off inflation, there were worries that the federal government would spend hundreds of billions of dollars and therefore would be operating at odds to the bank. Well, it does look like they are going in the same direction, and the government is trying to help the bank in fight inflation.
Okay, Susan, what headline would you give this budget?
The same line that they often put on the text of speeches, check against delivery. That I am really struck reading the budget by how much of it seems to have been written in the past month and a half. You know, that so much this government has had, by necessity, has become a very reactive government. It reacts to crises. And this is a budget that is again, another reaction to all kinds of crises. There's a lot of words about, you know, we may have to revisit this. Things are a work in progress. They have to see how things go. So budgets like to be a snapshot in time, but this is a moving piece of work.
A work in progress.
Yes.
Yeah. What about, okay, you mentioned response to events. One event was the agreement with the NDP. How much of the NDP do you see in this budget? Because a lot of people are watching for that agreement of certain programs and certain promises.
Yeah, I mean, I think people figured this was going to be basically an NDP budget. It is not. In fact, there's a lot in it that Conservatives will like. You know, while the stuff that the NDP wanted is there, the dental care for under 12s this year, the housing issues, the housing initiatives, it's actually overshadowed by a lot of the other stuff. Defence spending, for one. I mean, that's, to Susan's point, that's a reaction to the geopolitical scene. But also a lot of initiatives on innovation and productivity. I think the government's been spooked by a whole bunch of things, one of which is inflation, one of which is geopolitics, but also a whole bunch of stats coming out of the OECD which suggested that Canada's going to be dead last in per capita growth over the next 10 years. And the budget even mentions the fact that business research and development is the lowest of all our G7 peers. So the government is now trying to change that. Christian Fielding in our foreword to the budget called it our Achilles heel. And so there's an attempt to mend that vulnerability by creating a new Canada Growth Fund, by creating a new agency called Canada Innovation and Investment
Agency. Yeah.
There are tax credits for carbon capture and sequestration. There's a whole bunch of stuff that the Conservatives, I think, will be quite happy with.
Susan, what do you make of it in terms of the traces of the NDP in this budget?
I think I see more evidence, like John says, I see more evidence of what prompted the deal with the NDP. The deal was made while Ottawa was occupied by a convoy protest as the war in Ukraine was heating up, and the idea of stability was the motivating factor. And you see a lot of emphasis in this budget about stability, and to the points John is making about reassuring people that stability is possible.
You mentioned response also to events, and again, events. Well, one of the other responses was defense spending. What do you make of the response in terms of defense spending? I mean, there was the commitment, and now we see a certain commitment to increase defense spending to approach or to get closer to the NATO aspirational goal.
I was not expecting them to get to the 2% target in this budget, or maybe even any budget, for two reasons. One, that's very expensive. I think my colleague Tonda McCharles, she had done a big piece, pinned it at around $20 billion, and it's 8 in this one. This government doesn't do things abroad unless in concert with its allies, and the defense part of this budget is very focused on, again, check against delivery, check against further talks with our NATO and NORAD partners.
Response to both defense spending or Ukraine, or either?
Yeah, I think the $6 billion for existing defence functions is not going to have them quaking in the Kremlin, but it is an indication that that's where the government's mind is going now. I mean, Freeland again talked about freedom is not free, and I think as big a criticism as underspending on this government on its defence policies has been lack of political direction.
Yeah.
And even the 2017 document didn't really say where we were going with defence. It was really, we're just going to sprinkle some more money here, there and everywhere. And they've now called for another spending defence review to look at resources and roles and responsibilities and figure out whether we're actually going in the right direction. And there are many people who say, well, look, we can't really contribute many ground forces to Europe. We don't have anything to provide an air cover or anti-tank cover or whatever. But we can protect the northwest perimeter of NATO, which is the Arctic, and so maybe that's where we're going. And I think it's encouraging that the government is now starting to think about these things.
Last question: any surprises in this budget? Anything take you?
Well, I was surprised that the government's now starting to talk about innovation and productivity after having pretty much ignored it for 7 years.
Any surprises?
I should have a ready answer for that, but I don't. I don't see any big. There's no surprise. There's no little trinket in here. Previous ones, you've seen the penny disappear.
There's no gimmicks.
No gimmicks. No, nothing in here. So
unless there's something we've missed.
Well, and that's possible.
Okay. Well, both of you, thank you very much for taking the time.
Thanks.